For good to exist in the world, there must also be evil. Welcome to the worst of 1989.
On a scale of 1 to 10, what am I? And she said, you're an 8. So I peed on her shoes. You're an 8.
In conclusion, 1989 was a land of contrasts. The best of times, the worst of times. I'm saying that we saw lots of genuine masterpieces that year, but also lots of games that did not spark joy. The NES's market and its library expanded considerably that year, but not everything that came along brought joy to the hearts of little boys and girls. First, I have to give a special dishonorable mention to Strider for NES. Now, there were quite a few 1989 NES games worse than Strider, but none fell quite so desperately short of what they should have been. Have you ever played the arcade version of Strider? It's so good. The NES version of Strider, it's a completely different game. Once you run left to right in Kazakh SSR for a few screens, it goes in a totally different direction than the other game. A Metroidvania direction, but a very rough one. One with choppy controls and physics, which according to Behind the Code, has to do with a very small piece of programming that can be tweaked easily in order to greatly improve the game. Bummer that this one didn't get even a few more minutes in the oven. It could have been so much more. Ah, Airwolf, the game that broke the dam and gave us Beam software. Oh, here comes the flood. We will say goodbye to games that are good. Well, that's not fair, but Airwolf does kind of encapsulate the change in design philosophy and polish that come hand in hand with the shift to Western studios and away from Japanese developers. Airwolf, in fairness, tries to do a lot with its television license. Ostensibly a helicopter combat game, the ultimate goal of most stages revolves around rescuing hostages, like Choplifter. Instead of doing the side-scrolling Choplifter thing, though, it goes for more of a first-person perspective, bounded by a map display. Where it falls apart is in the fact that your chopper's orientation and speed are almost impossible to determine without looking at displays. Nothing visibly changes in the main action window when you move around. It means well, but it feels bad. Not a great combo. And somehow, every hostage you rescue appears to be the same woman in a nightgown, which, I don't know. Hey, here it is, my favorite punching bag for 1989, and it's only number 9 on the list? Yes, I'm afraid so. Kung Fu Heroes is a bad game that would have been mildly tolerable as a 1986 release alongside, say, Ninja Kid. As a 1989 release, though, man, this just doesn't cut it. You play as a martial artist walking and jumping around, punching things, in single-screen levels full of invisible objects that you need to hit or, sometimes, to avoid. The forced perspective makes it difficult to line up your attacks with the placement of enemies. The mediocre controls make it difficult to want to try. The substandard design makes it difficult to care. But at least the graphics look okay, and it has some weird and intriguing elements, and the sound effects are solid, since they're all from Super Mario Bros. I guess I don't hate it completely. The Three Stooges, though, I do hate this one. There is clearly a slice of humanity for whom The Three Stooges works. People who really like the actual comedy troupe, and who played this game on Amiga, where it looked pretty good, and hung together on its aesthetics. And I guess kids who liked The Three Stooges, the comedy troupe, and had the NES version and no other games. A collection of minigames based on various iconic Stooges shorts? Fine. It's that disjointed PC film adaptation style that people in the 80s and 90s kind of grew to loathe. A bunch of completely different events that you don't really get to play long enough in one go to get a handle on how they work. The NES tries to recreate the detailed visuals of the Amiga version to the best of its ability, and some of the film stills look pretty good considering the hardware. But the playable scenes look rough, and they don't really function well. The controls are iffy, and collision detection can be a real hassle. It's a vague wisp of a game that you can complete in 15 minutes, and even with an element of randomization at the event selection, it's just not a good experience. Shout out to Twin Eagle for being the second worst shooter on NES for 1989. Sometimes it's nice to know that you're not the absolute worst, though Twin Eagle certainly gives it a shot. A slushy action game at its best moments, Twin Eagle lacks variety and, well, much of anything of interest. The power-up system, in which you lose everything upon taking damage, pairs poorly with the unrelenting difficulty level. It's one of those games that feels kind of manageable if you are able to build up a few levels of power-ups, but actually surviving long enough to accumulate some levels of strength is unreasonably difficult. It feeds a loop in which you can never enjoy the powers you do gain because you can't gain enough to make them sustainable, if that makes sense. The closest Twin Eagle comes to mixing things up is a rush mode at the end of each stage. This substitutes for bosses, which don't exist. The only boss to speak of is the final encounter, which consists of a collection of stationary turrets that you have to blow up slowly and laboriously while enemy planes fly at you. Actually, maybe I'm wrong. This might be the worst shooter of 1989 after all. Oh well, too late to rework my list now. Tom Sawyer is a strange little game for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, being the fact that it got its start on Famicom in Japan in 1989, not in like 1985 the way you'd probably assume. It certainly plays like a game from 1985, and not a good 1985 game like Super Mario Bros. More like a mid-tier Famicom release like Onyanko Town, which I actually liked in the context of 1985, but I would not have liked in the context of 1989. Sorry, but Seta sent Tom Sawyer marching out against things like Mega Man 2. It does not punch at that weight class, not at all. This is one of those single-hit death platform games where you spend more time fighting the crude physics and spiteful monster placement than you do the actual enemies. Also, you fight visual ambiguity. The level layouts love to make the distinction between foreground and background very fuzzy. The really weird thing about this game is the localization. Not in terms of text or anything. There was hardly any text to localize from Japanese into English, honestly, and it's all based on a classic American novel, more or less. Though for some reason Seta switched up the level order for the game in the US, moving the opening raft ride into a later stage, and moving the incredibly difficult 6th stage right up to the front. It's quite a choice. It's like the game is daring you to enjoy it. Go on, just you try. Well, I daren't. Fortune doesn't favor the bold with this one, while the meek shall inherit to the earth. Fist of the North Star, the manga, is a stone-cold classic. Fist of the North Star, the game, is not. The thing about Fist of the North Star is that the further you move away from the original manga, the more joyless and po-faced the adaptations get. The original book by Tetsuhara is brutal and bloody, but it also has a vitality and sense of life to it thanks to the incredible artwork and the fact that all manga seems to get away with sneaking in little goofy details and characters. The anime, on the other hand, is dour and stiff, mostly memorable for its audacious violence and all-time hilariously bad 1980s English dub. This game is even stiffer, which is bad, because this is a video game. Nobody wants a stiff video game. As with seemingly all non-fitness games about Fist of the North Star, this Fist of the North Star involves protagonist Kenshiro walking left to right and punching random low-tier losers until they explode, then getting into big fights with bosses. Eventually the bosses explode too. Unlike most other Fist of the North Star games, this one involves the second half of the manga rather than the first. Want to fight the guys you recognized from the cartoon, which was brought to the US with a hilariously bad 1980s dub around the time this game shipped? Too bad, there's no heart here, no Rao. Even if you were the rare American kid who loved black and white comics in the year of our Lord 1989, and therefore had context for Fist of the North Star, you still didn't really have context for Fist of the North Star. Well, that's not quite true. If you played any of the vast number of other better games released in 1989, you'd have context to understand that this wasn't really very good. And also just enough context to be confused by the suspiciously similar Last Battle on Sega Genesis, which totally seemed like the same thing as this, except better? What the hell? Back to the Future, on the other hand, every American had the context to be angry about this one. Even if they'd missed it in theaters, which was tough to do when the studio brought it back to hype up the long-awaited second part that arrived in November 1989, Back to the Future had become a staple. TV movie airings, cable showings, VHS rentals. It was one of those movies that simply seemed inescapable in the late 1980s. Naturally, Beam Software and publisher LJN leaned into the audience's familiarity with the material to create a game that felt totally faithful to the film. No, just kidding. The NES game bears practically no resemblance to the movie. I mean, there are signifiers. You play as a guy in what might be the 1950s. Marty McFly was a guy who got stuck in the 1950s. Maybe they're the same guy. You got your greasers and a malt shop. Those were also in the movie. Now, Marty didn't throw milkshakes at greasers in a simplistic tower defense precursor. Marty also didn't have to run and skate past waves of random freaks while avoiding bees and stuff either. The few sequences that do resemble the film, playing a crude music rhythm game on stage or actually driving the DeLorean time machine, are buried so far inside the game, so far behind endlessly tedious scrolling stages that you have to play repeatedly if you make a single mistake in the gimmick boss stages. And all the while, you have to listen to a terrible musical loop, which apparently is just the riff from The Power of Love, sped up to the point that it hits your eardrums like a lawnmower blade. There have been and will be worse movie adaptations on NES, don't you worry, but this one is still remarkably bad, and for such a goddamn classic. Cybernoid, I've learned, is a game that holds a certain degree of reverence in certain quarters. Those quarters, it seems, are not the domain of people who first played Cybernoid on NES. On Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, the game found a fanbase and has remained fairly beloved. But bear in mind that on ZX Spectrum, it looked quite a bit better than on NES. The C64 version looked better and sounded better. This NES version misses the mark. The lack of a meaningful soundtrack, the fudgy controls compared to so many other games on the system, it's like a much worse version of HAL's Air Fortress. Air Fortress may not have made my top 10 for 1989, but it certainly plays better than Cybernoid for NES. There are some interesting elements to this game, like the way it kind of plays like a puzzler in which you have to discern which weapon option you need in order to advance, but that does not counterbalance the crabby visuals and utterly unforgiving collision detection. I guess I grew up on the wrong continent to love this one. Hey, you know what sucks? The worst shooter of 1989. That's what. To channel the spirit of my peers who talk trash about old video games on the internet, I'm fairly certain that the thunder in Thundercade is chocolate thunder. Farts. Because the game stinks like a fart, you see. It's funny. The audacity of someone publishing a game like this in the year 1989 is really something else. Now, if this were an Atari 2600 release in 1989, I'd say, wow, I can't believe they pulled this off on that hardware. But this is not a 2600 release. This is a game on the console that gave us Zanuck and Life Force. It's the console that gave us Tiger Heli. It can do better than Thundercade. The 2600 could do better than Thundercade, honestly, but the NES definitely can. And yet this is a game that American Sammy thrust upon us willingly, in a world where you could just go to a store and buy 1943 The Battle of Midway with your own human dollars. Unbelievable. To understand what makes Thundercade so reprehensible, the easiest thing to do would be to take a pair of hard-soled shoes and beat yourself repeatedly in the eyeball with them. That is the approximate sensation of looking at and playing Thundercade. Thundercade chugs its way along with its ugly flickering sprites and staticky sound effects, a true assault on the senses in every respect. On top of its poor controls and awful technical performance, Thundercade suffers from the same power-up death loop as the vomitously similar Twin Eagle, and that hanging on to the power-ups long enough to build up the power you need to endure through the horrible stage challenges is practically impossible. But on the other hand, there's nothing about Thundercade that would make you want to endure through the horrible stages, so you can simply pretend this game doesn't exist if you like, and we'll all be happier that way. The thing about the Uncanny X-Men is that it might be the only NES game that's so bad we don't actually know who made it. And that's understandable. I would not want my name attached to this piece of misery either. Like a lot of people, I discovered the X-Men in the early 1990s thanks to all the hype surrounding the launch of X-Men #1. and all the young buck celebrity creators involved in the books at the time. And at that time, Uncanny X-Men by LJN and God only knows who was the only X-Men game available on consoles. I have to assume that an awful lot of kids ended up with this game as a result of their newfound love for Marvel's mutants, and every single one of them had a terrible time of it. As for myself, I actually caught a whiff of something unpleasant about X-Men at the time, and avoided the game until producing my retrospective a few months ago. Now that I've played the game for myself, I can say that it somehow manages to be vastly worse than I actually thought possible. Sometimes you look at a game and think, oh, it can't be that bad, but that's because you have baseline assumptions about good design and enjoyable play experiences. The Uncanny X-Men defies those at every turn. Oh, it does acknowledge the nature of the licensed property in small ways. Each of the mutants you control has powers that sort of resemble their abilities in the books to some degree, and each mutant has a different level of durability and power, with Nightcrawler being comically fragile but speedy, while Colossus can soak up damage yet lacks a ranged attack. You can't go into stages solo because you're a team. You pick 2 mutants per stage and can swap between control of them at any time, which is where our problems begin. The second mutant in your duo runs around under computer control, and the computer guides them with the same mindless ineptitude that it uses for standard monsters. The difference is that standard monsters spawn infinitely and harm a mutant by touch, while your X-Men take damage on touch, and once one dies, you have to select a new character and start all over again. Add to that the miserable controls, unclear level design, bizarre and unavoidable mechanics that sap health, and so on. It all adds up to one of the most vexingly awful games ever created. I'm not being hyperbolic here for the sake of drama. I'm not going on some obscene, exaggerated rant for comedy. The Uncanny X-Men literally has no redeeming features outside of the pretty good cover artwork, and it establishes a new baseline for video game wretchedness. As I can test from my personal experience, no matter how terrible you expect the Uncanny X-Men to be, the reality is far worse. And that's it. The worst of the worst for 1989. Speaking of baselines for wretchedness, you'll notice that I didn't include any unlicensed games here. That's because no one likes it when someone punches down. So I promise that I'll be on my best behavior when we hit those unlicensed games, maybe literally, when NES Works returns in a few months.